Insects may be low on the food chain, but they are, of course, essential. And a growing body of research has set off alarms that the world could be in for big trouble, with fears of colony collapse now spreading well beyond the honeybees that you may have already heard so much about. Joining us now on the threat of what's been called an insect apocalypse and what can be done about it in New York, New York, Jessica Ware, entomologist specializing in evolution and associate professor of biology at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey. In Troy, New York, via Skype, Brad Lister, ecologist and researcher at RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. And here in our studio, Victoria McPhail, co-chair of Pollination Guelph, a nonprofit organization promoting a pollinator habitat in Southern Ontario. She's also a doctoral student with the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University in Toronto, and it's great to have Victoria, you here on our program, and to Jessica and Brad in Points Beyond, thank you for joining us as well. Can I start with what I assume is an anecdote all of us at some point in our lives would have experienced, which is that trip up north or to the cottage or to cottage country or something in rural parts. And by the time we got to wherever we were trying to get to, the grill or windshield of our car was completely covered in bugs and various other stuff. That doesn't seem to happen so much anymore. Victoria, why not?
We think it's because there are just less insects. Some people try to explain it away by cars being more aerodynamic and the bugs just go over top of the windshield and don't actually go splat. But we think there's just a lot less insects in the landscape. We've been seeing it in terms of our bumblebee surveys, our general insect surveys, both here in Canada and around the world. There's just less insects. And that's also having ripple effects through the food chain. There's less birds out there as well now.
Brad, you've done a significant study on this. Perhaps you could share some of what your most significant findings were from that study.
Yes, I returned to the rainforest in Puerto Rico with a colleague from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, Andres Garcia, to resample insects that I sampled back in the 70s in the rainforest. And after a couple of days, we knew something was terribly amiss, because in the 70s, the traps that we catch the insects in would be black at the end of the day. We'd put them out in the morning, and then we'd pick the insects off at night. In this most recent trip, Andres and I went to pick the insects off, and there just wasn't much there. Maybe a few lonely diptera and a beetle or two trapped in the sticky substance. And that continued for 5 days. So it was clear that, that something had caused the insects to undergo a catastrophic collapse.
This may sound like a ridiculous question, and if it is, it wouldn't be the first time I've asked one on this program, but how do you know you just didn't get there on the wrong days?
Yeah, that's a good question. We do, the way that things we have to do is to do replicates of our study. We can't just do it once. So we came back in the dry season, this is during the wet season, and then back again in the next wet season, and again in the dry season. So we had 4 replicates of the population levels as measured by the traps, and they all showed almost exactly the same declines, about 90% decline in biomass in the ground traps. We also put traps up into the canopy. There, the decline in biomass was on the order of 80%. And finally, as another measure of insect abundance, we do sweep nets, which are essentially very sturdy butterfly nets that we sweep back and forth through the lower vegetation up to a meter or so in height, and then count the insects that we've captured later on in the lab. And those were down 75% on average.
Let me do one more follow-up with you before I get Jessica in here, and that is, as I asked the control room to bring up this graphic, there was a big story in the New York Times not too long ago with the headline, Insect Apocalypse. What's been the reaction to that?
Yeah, the first news story that they did on our work, Andres and myself work, they called it Insect Armageddon. And I was just like, oh no, what are they doing? My reputation is shot. Because scientists just don't speak in terms of these over-the-top metaphors and language. About extinction, we're very careful not to use that word unless we're absolutely sure a species is going extinct in a given group. And so I was concerned. But over the past 6 months, I think thanks to my interaction with the journalists, actually, who've been wonderful and have helped, spread this real growing problem around the world. I mean, most scientists lead lives of quiet obscurity, but suddenly you're thrust into a spotlight and you realize the importance of journalism and shows like yours. So we came to the realization that there was time, past the time to start using strong language, to start telling the story very forcefully as we could.
Well, we apologize in advance for contributing to your lack of obscurity then, which will continue as a result of your being here, we hope. Jessica, come on in here and tell us whether or not you concur with the analysis you've heard so far.
I think that the idea that we should all be concerned is a commonly felt one among entomologists, which are the folks that are the scientists that study insects. We all kind of have anecdotal evidence that suggests that insects are declining. And these 3 or 4 main studies that have recently come out that kind of sound the alarm, like Brad was saying, those kind of give us a visceral reaction saying, oh, I've noticed this too. The problem is, of course, we don't have enough of these studies. So would that we could have the type of study that Brad did in Puerto Rico replicated over and over again in all of the different habitats that insects inhabit. That type of data would really give us a powerful conclusion that we could take to our policymakers and take to the public so that people will be kind of forced to really look at the data and see that there's an issue and then perhaps help us maybe make some predictions on what we could do effectively to kind of make a change.
Well, let me ask the obvious follow-up question, which is, if there are many, many, many fewer insects, so what?
Well, I mean, the issue, of course, is that there's lots of things that rely on insects. Humans, of course, there's a lot of ecosystem services that insects do for us. Many of the things that you've already done today, actually, your life has already been touched in some way by insects, from the food that you ate to the fact that when you went outside, you weren't tripping over undecomposed logs and such. I mean, termites do a great service for us. But getting people to be excited about saving maggots or saving horseflies or saving termites, that's always going to be a bit of a hard sell. And in my lab, we study cockroaches, and cockroaches are something that people only really think of as a pest insect. But of course, cockroaches do a great service. The majority of cockroaches are not pests, and they are active decomposers, and we need them. Kind of forest health relies on them. And many of the things that are charismatic, as I think someone else already mentioned earlier, things like birds, things like lizards, even things like spiders, which maybe aren't necessarily charismatic, but these insect eating organisms, they rely on insects. And we also don't really know how a loss of insects might impact the larger community as a whole. Of course, species are always interacting with each other. And when you lose one or when you lose several, we don't really know what's going to happen to the other members of a community. And so, that's the type of data, that's exactly the type of data that we really need to be trying to collect, and that's the type of research that we should be funding.
Victoria, would you mind following up on that, in as much as I suspect a lot of people watching us right now will think, as we head into the summer and cottage country, what, no black flies? I'm okay with that. Oh, no mosquitoes? I'm okay with that.
The problem is, as much as we don't like mosquitoes or black flies, they're just such a critical part of the ecosystem.
How so?
There's just so many things feed on them, whether it's things like the frogs or the birds, and then ripple effects through there. Like, what are the birds? If you lose a bird singing in the trees, would you notice that? If you lose the frogs, singing in the summertime, would you notice that? Would you notice just changes in everything from the flowers to the trees and everything beyond? We don't know these interactions that are happening in the landscape. Sure, one species, why do we care? There's thousands of bugs out there. There's umpteen types of mosquitoes alone. Who cares if there's just one mosquito goes away? But the problem is we don't know the ripple effects. We're concerned about what happens if we do lose one species.
We're going to show a picture here. Sheldon, if you wouldn't mind, bring up this shot of the American bumblebee study. Okay, Victoria, that's yours. What did you find in that study?
Sadly, I'm using the term critically endangered. As Jessica said, it's not a term we want to use very often, but we found about 89% decline in the species from the historic, about 100-year period as compared to the last decade. About
89%?
89% decline in relative abundance, which is huge.
In what geographic area?
Southern Ontario and Quebec, which is the northern range of this species. So it's never super common in the landscape. We figured about 37 bees out of every 1,000 you'd catch would be this species, but it's dropped so much it'd be 4 in every 1,000. So yes, you could find it today. You could go to the proper habitat and perhaps you could find it, but it's few and far between, and that it is much harder to find now. And it's just drastically declining still, that even the biggest drops seem to be the 80s, 90s, but it's still continuing to today. And it's getting so close to zero population, that we're worried that it would become extinct in the near future.
Extinct?
Extinct, yeah. Again, not a word we want to use, but it's a word that, like Armageddon and apocalypse, people start paying attention to.
I understand how you're doing the count today, but if you want to make a comparison, say, to a century or 2 centuries ago, what records could exist that you would be making comparisons to?
We're very fortunate that people were collecting insects, mostly hobbyists, naturalists, some early entomologists were out there collecting butterflies, bumblebees, and putting them in collections. So they'd pin the insects and put them in a drawer in a museum or perhaps even their basement. And now they're starting to come to the light of day, and colleagues are now being able to collect that data from the museum records, add it into a database. So I have a colleague, Dr. Leif Richardson from the University of Vermont, who has assembles this database of literally thousands of records, tens of thousands of records of bumblebees from across North America. So it gives us data literally back to, I think, 1844 is the earliest record we have for Ontario for a bumblebee. So we're able to use that historic data from museum specimens with our own field data. So from the last 10 years or so, my colleagues and I have, again, tens of thousands of records from more recent surveys. So now we're able to compare the recent time to the historic time to see what exactly is happening.
Gotcha. Brad, is it that scientists have only now realized that these numbers are dangerously low, or is it that only journalists have now realized it and are starting to talk to scientists and therefore bringing it to the public's attention? Which of those 2 sentences would be more accurate?
Well, they're both accurate. I think scientists have known that insects are declining. In Europe, for example, they've known butterflies and beetles for decades. But like Jessica said, we just didn't have the samples and the replicates from around the world. We're starting to get those coming in. There was a recent paper that looked at 73 historical records of insect populations, and they concluded that 40% of the insect species now living on the planet will go extinct over the next few decades. That's how dramatic the declines were across the world. But we still need more samples. And in the tropics, they only had 3 samples. One was ours. So tropics that harbor 78% of the world's insects need much more attention. We need to know much more about what's going on there.
Okay, you mentioned your study already down in the tropics. What about the one in Krefeld, Germany? Can you tell us about that one?
Yeah, Krefeld, Germany was an eye-opener. They looked at, I think, 63 nature reserves in Germany. They eliminated habitat destruction, and they found altogether 75% decline in insect biomass in those reserves. So it was shocking to many people that protected areas you could see this kind of decline. It was the first real wake-up call, I think, for scientists and then for journalists as well, that what's going on is very serious.
75% between now and how far back?
I think the Krefeld study went over about 20 years.
Okay. Jessica, let's get to the whys. Why are we seeing such dramatic insect population declines now?
It's a good question. I mean, as scientists, we always want to know the drivers of change. And when we see a decline, we want to know what could be causing the decline. And it's because we don't have enough data, it's hard to really pinpoint it to one specific cause. That would be fantastic if we could say there was this one bad thing that was happening, we'll stop that one bad thing, and then we'd be done with it. But it's more likely a bunch of small things and a few large things that combine together in an additive way to cause this decline. So we know that the climate is changing. We know that there's been increased amount of catastrophic weather events. There's been changes in the frequency of drought, changes in the amount of precipitation, the general temperature has been increasing, and this can threaten insects that are in habitats, especially in some of the parts of Canada, up in the Arctic. We're seeing dramatic changes in the species composition in the populations of dragonflies that we're studying there. So all of these things together, changing amounts of habitat, fragmentation of habitat, all of these things can additively, have a negative effect on insect populations.
Okay, all of those things, climate, drought, temperatures, precipitation, Victoria, they all relate, of course, to climate change. Would there be anything else on the list unrelated to climate change which you think might also be contributing to this?
There are a lot of other human factors that we need to consider. Habitat loss, for one. Again, if there's no place for the insects like the bumblebees to nest, to get food, to overwinter, then obviously they're not going to do very well. And a lot of that is human caused. For example, grasslands in Ontario have just been lost, the forests are being lost.
Is this because we're paving paradise and
We're
putting up
paving
a
paradise
parking
and
lot?
putting up a parking lot.
Okay,
And Southern
got it.
Ontario is notorious
Yeah.
for that, unfortunately. But then you also have things like pesticide use. Again, climate change is an issue, but then we have human actions like pesticide use. We have issues with diseases, both natural diseases that are increasing, but also diseases coming in, for example, for pollinators. We have issues with non-native diseases or non-native bees bringing in diseases that affect the wild bees. And so we have issues with that type of thing. And even non-native species themselves, whether it be plant or animal, can have impacts on our ecosystems.
Now, I thought the government of Ontario just made a decision to cut back on the kinds of neonicotinoids that farmers are allowed to use, neonics, I guess you call them, which would presumably protect the bee population better. Is that the case?
It's somewhat the case. The government did introduce some legislation or some encouragement to get farmers to reduce the use of neonics on soybeans and corn. But the reduction hasn't been as sort of picked up as much as we had hoped. Reductions aren't as low as we had hoped. And that was just on 2 crops. It's being used, these pesticides are being used on other crops and even horticulture industry. So there's even concern about, the flowers you buy at home, or, a big box store, I don't want to name certain ones, that could have neonics on the flowers. So the flowers you're putting out in the springtime could potentially have pesticides in it. So
Is the bee population coming back at all?
unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be, but that's not a clear-cut answer because some bees actually are doing okay. It's not a case of all pollinators, all bees, all insects are in decline. There are some species that seem to like human habitations and be doing okay in urban areas. So it's not a clear-cut story.
Got it. Brad, what did you deduce from your study and how did you come to your conclusion?
Well, we deduced that after eliminating some factors such as pesticides, Puerto Rico has transitioned to an industrial economy away from agriculture over the past 50 years. And we were able to show that the use of pesticides has declined precipitously to almost zero. So pesticides have a half-life of maybe days or weeks. So we didn't think pesticides were a factor in the Puerto Rican rainforest. All the techniques that we use, statistical techniques to assess what the drivers were, pointed to increasing temperatures over and over and over again. So we concluded that was one of the major drivers. However, there are many other environmental factors that can affect insect abundances in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean and the tropics, including El Nino, La Nina, including the increases in droughts, the increase in torrential rainfall. All of these are having an effect, and as far as we could tell, a negative effect, but temperatures seem to be the major factor. So there's many.
But even if we made some progress against climate change, we're not going to make any progress against El Nino. That's been around for a long time.
And they're getting more severe because of climate change as well. And we showed in the paper that they're definitely impacting the abundances in a very fine-grained way. As soon as El Nino came in, dry, hot weather, the insects decline. And La Nina, cooler, more rain, the insect increase. But that's just overlaying on a long-term decline in the insects in the forest.
Okay, let me read an excerpt here from the New York Times Magazine that we referenced earlier. Sheldon, if you would, bring up this graphic, and those who can watch us on television, read along if you will. There were studies of other better understood species that suggested that the insects associated with them might be declining too. People who studied fish found that the fish had fewer mayflies to eat. Ornithologists kept finding that birds that rely on insects for food were in trouble. 8 in 10 partridges gone from French farmlands. 50 and 80% drops, respectively, for nightingales and turtle doves. Half of all farmland birds in Europe disappeared in just 3 decades. At first, many scientists assumed the familiar culprit of habitat destruction was at work, but then they began to wonder if the birds might simply be starving. Brad, what other parts of the natural world are at risk with this drop in insect populations?
Well, pretty much all other parts, because insects are such a central group of species. They're really keystone species in any ecosystem. They're close to the bottom of the food web, so they're affected by the plants, and everything above them gets affected. So you can't separate the effects of any of these losses, any of these species extinctions, from any other part of the ecosystem. It's all connected, and everything will eventually have effect, either indirectly or directly.
Jessica, that New York Times story mentioned, and here's the expression here, functional extinction rather than complete extinction. What kind of an effect would functional extinction have in the various ecosystems that you study?
Well, I mean, for the types of services and community interactions that insects kind of provide, functional extinction means that effectively they're no longer in sufficient numbers that they're able to perform those services. And that could cause a collapse. It could cause even a local extinction of a community. But I mean, the thing that to remember with insects is that what we might see, in addition to extinction in some places, is we might just see turnover. So that the members, the players, the actors in the play might be different actors, and that might have, beneficial effects in some places, but more than likely it will change the way that we view the cottage, the way that we experience sitting on the dock up at the cottage in Muskoka. Maybe there'll be fewer of one species and more of another. But I mean, there's more insects than there is anything else on Earth, and so when we think about this, it's so hard to say very much about the predictions that we're making are hard to make when we don't have the data that we need. There's more species of insects than there really is anything else on Earth. They've been around for a really long time. And so to really do justice to answer these type of questions, we need more data.
And I guess I should ask, what's the difference between functional extinction and complete extinction?
Well, complete extinction is forever. Complete extinction is a complete loss of a species, but even when you say complete extinction, there's a bit of semantics there, because of course you can have extinction that's a local extinction, where maybe there's something that's no longer found in southern Ontario or northern New Jersey, but it might be found in other parts of its range, compared to complete extinction, where on planet Earth it no longer exists. You can have reduction in genetic diversity, populations that are so small that they're no longer able to support themselves, and they will eventually go extinct. So even just the way that we define the term extinction can be sort of variable depending on the discipline that you're in, whether you're more of an evolutionary biologist or an ecologist, and the types of organisms that you study, and the parts of the community that you're looking at. But what we're seeing now is a dramatic acceleration in extinction. There have been several mass extinction events that have taken place over the history of life on Earth, and the period that we're in right now is kind of a sixth mass extinction that is likely human-driven.
All right, Victoria, I'm going to read another excerpt from that New York Times Magazine, then I'll get you to comment on this excerpt. Scientists have tried to calculate the benefits that insects provide simply by going about their business in large numbers. Trillions of bugs, flitting from flower to flower, pollinate some 3/4 of our food crops, a service worth as much as $500 billion every year. This doesn't count the 80% of wild flowering plants, the foundation blocks of life everywhere, that rely on insects for pollination. If monetary calculations like that sound strange, consider the Maoxian Valley in China, where shortages of insect pollinators have led farmers to hire human workers at a cost of up to $19 per worker per day to replace bees. Each person covers 5 to 10 trees a day, pollinating apple blossoms by hand. Is that where we're going, Victoria? Pollination by hand in order to grow fruit?
We can't, not on the scale that agriculture is currently being run here in Ontario and around the world. that even in China, even for that area, they actually, since so that study came out, they've actually ripped out the orchards. They aren't growing the apples and the pears anymore, because even in China, it's just too cost prohibitive to have someone manually go from flower to flower on a tree. And so, no, we can't do it by hand.
So there's no other options besides natural pollination?
No,
Not really?
Not really. There's some jokes out there about getting robotic bees to go out and do the work, but consider even in Canada alone, there's about 850 different types of bees, not including flies that do pollination, not including the beetles that do pollination, and the other animals. And each of them have a slightly different behavior, the different size, different morphologies, and that you just can't mimic what's actually happening in nature naturally.
Well, in which case, we need some solutions here. So, Brad, you want to start us off, please? What's something we can do about this?
Well, first of all, we have to reduce emissions, as the UN has stated, and many, many other scientists, as fast as possible. The UN had a time frame of over the next 10 years or so when their report came out last fall. And recently they said, no, we have to start doing this globally coordinated by 2020. So it's a daunting task. We've got the technology where we could reduce emissions. We just lack, as far as I can see, the urgency and the willpower collectively to do it.
Jessica, what would you add to the list of stuff we can do to improve this situation?
Well, you could definitely contact the people that make policy in your neighborhood and make sure that they're supporting the funding for basic research and basic science. And importantly, you can visit and support your local museums. So natural history museums are a great collection of data of what insects were found where over a long period of time. And so the more that we can support basic research and the more that we can support natural history museums, the more we can get to this type of data that we need to answer these questions and make really good predictions when we do decide to have conservation measures put in place.
Okay, Victoria, beyond visiting a museum, beyond trying to use less harmful emissions, calling our politicians, asking them to get involved, what else is on the list?
A variety of different things. One is for insects, just creating more habitat, whether it's on your back 40 if you have a large rural property, or even on your balcony if you live in downtown Toronto in an apartment building. Every little bit of habitat does help our pollinators and all our other insects.
So specifically, that means what? When you talk about creating a habitat?
Habitat is where the insects can live, both over the winter and then during the year. It could be food for them. It could be places to mate, that type of thing. And especially for like bumblebees, which is my focal species, you need to consider when are they actually active, so they're awake, alert, moving around in the landscape, and what food is there for them. Often in our gardens, we kind of focus on the July and August time periods, that's when the gardens are full of blooms. But right now, the bumblebees are emerging from hibernation, and there's very little out there for them to feed on. So we need to consider these kind of shoulder seasons. Like start planting for things that bloom in April and May. Plant for things that bloom in September and October. Really consider what the needs of the bees are and the other insects when you're choosing your plants.
What blooms in September and October?
Asters and goldenrods. People often think of goldenrods as being this messy, invasive, really spready plant, but they're so amazing for insects. You look at them, they're just alive, just full of buzz. And you get the right varieties, they're happy to grow anywhere.
Now, you're all professionals on our program today, but Jessica, there are things such as citizen scientists. What do they and can they contribute to what we're talking about tonight?
So pretty much anyone can be a citizen scientist. These are members of the public that can go out and help scientists collect the data that they need that can fit into a larger study, making observations. Sometimes it's measuring things. There's lots of venues that you can kind of get hooked up with a scientist. You can reach out to scientists at your local universities, but also there's several online projects. We've had citizen scientists that helped us measuring dragonfly wings through the power of the internet. So all you needed was a computer. And any scientist, whether you're a citizen scientist or a scientist that's hired at an academic institution or in an industry and position, all of us together, if we collect good data, ultimately it helps us answer these questions that we want to answer. So there's pretty much, I know for Ontario, there's quite a few citizen scientist projects that you can undertake. But if you want to, have a chance to look at the tropics or some of the places that Brad described in their study, there are citizen science projects that you can do kind of tropically or internationally, even just through the internet.
Victoria, bring it home. Citizen scientists in Ontario, do they contribute to this?
For sure. Like so much information we're getting from citizen scientists, even with my own Bumblebee paper recently. Almost a third of the recent sites were found by citizen scientists. So they drastically increased our knowledge of what's happening here in Ontario. So we found even the common bee in your backyard could be a rare species. And so really encourage people to get involved and start looking at the world around them and start realizing it's more than just sort of greenery out there, maybe the odd flower. Look closer at the flower and see what actually is out there. You might be amazed at what you see.
Brad, in your judgment, do you think governments are adequately seized of the significance of this issue?
I couldn't say so from their actions and their behavior. No, I don't think that most scientists learn to think systemically. I don't think government officials really had that training, so they don't see the world and the natural world as a system, and the consequences of that system being so disturbed by human beings.
And Victoria,
Also,
sorry, go ahead.
Crayfeld study, that was really done by citizen scientists, all the data collecting. Scientists, involved were directing the project, and also many parts of Europe, these are the groups that collect the data. And one other thing, the Global Deal for Nature, and you mentioned conservation, that came out last week. And what they're trying to do is eventually protect 100% of the planet, starting out with 30% by 2030. That would be under UN level guidelines for protection, and then much more of the planet after that.
Victoria, let's bring it home again. The government of Ontario recently announced a species at risk stewardship program, $4.5 million in a fund to take care of that. What do you think that's going to do?
There's a variety of things that I have concerns with the recent legislation or proposed changes and such. And money is good. We always need more money for studying or research specimens, whether it's bumblebees, whether it's dragonflies, whether it's lizards. We always need more data. We always need more people involved. But the problem is more than just throwing more money into research. We need to conserve these species on the landscape. And some of the proposed changes, okay, let's just let the developer pay a little bit of money into a fund and remove that tree, remove that species from the landscape. But it's talked about what extinction is, it's gone. So after so many times, you kill so many trees, so many birds, and then they're gone. And so we really need to take action to preserve the species, preserve the habitats on a large scale, and put more money towards it. Although the pledging money in this sort of species conservation trust, also taking money away from the conservation authorities, the Ministry of the Environment, Ministry of Natural Resources, all these organizations that have been doing amazing work, or at least some pretty good work, could always do more for species. We're concerned that although they're pledging this money, they're actually taking away money on the other hand.
Brad, last word to you on this. I want to get a sense finally about how much time we have left before it's too late. At what point, how many years do we have left to act before we hit the point where we've missed the opening and we're too late?
Well, in terms of global warming, the estimates that I've seen lately are 20 to 30 years before we reach a point where there's so much carbon in the atmosphere, we're entering a point where there's essentially no stopping a runaway warming effect. And that's frightening. So we have to, that's why I mentioned first reducing emissions. If we don't do that, I think it's going to be a much tougher battle. We're fast approaching a point of no return. There's no doubt about that. And it's going to be upon us very, very soon.
I want to thank the three of you for coming on to TVO tonight and helping us learn so much new information about something that I suspect very few of us knew that much about. Victoria McPhail at York University, Brad Lister, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, Jessica Ware, Rutgers University. Great to have all of you on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.